Hello to everyone, hello to those who watch us, hello to our speakers and guests, and welcome to our English-speaking meeting in the studio of Tvoje místo Medía-hab. We are organizing this event, we started organizing such events maybe 2 weeks ago, when we realized that the world and also international journalists working in Lviv on the ground in Ukraine need more context about Ukraine, need more explanation on Ukraine, and more context on this war that is going on. Today we invited. First of all, I have to also add that usually we do these events not on the record, not live, and today we decided to live stream it, and today's event is also is hosted by Tvoje místo Medía-hab, but also co-organized with the National Office of Crimea platform, and that's why we will be co-moderating today this event with Marija Tomak, who represents National Office of the Crimea platform. And today we have a great topic. That's why we decided to live stream this event, and I hope you find it useful. Both those who watch us online live now and who came today offline, and those who will watch later. So I have to say that we are talking today about what should we do with Russia. It's a tough question, I suppose, for today. And we invited two great speakers. One of them, Yaroslav Gricak, is Ukrainian historian. He's a doctor of historical sciences and professor of the Ukrainian Catholic University. Also author of many books and publications in different languages, and also first vice president of the International Association of Ukrainians. Also we have a second speaker, Federico Varese, who is head of the sociology department and professor of criminology and a senior research fellow at Naffield College at Oxford. The main area of Professor Vareze's study is organized crime, and he has written many books and publications on Russian mafia, on the Soviet criminal history. So today we will speak on these issues, on what we can learn from the history, especially from history of Russia, and what we can learn from violent states and how they act, and what can we learn from that, and what should we do with that. And I would love Maria to tell more about our international speaker today.
Thank you, Taras. Thank you for hosting us today. And actually, I would not like to talk too much, because we have indeed an outstanding speakers today and a very interesting topic, which may sound a little bit provocative, I should say. And here I have to make a disclaimer, because you know, for you, maybe for our foreign colleagues, the wording, what should we do with Russia, may remind the name of the article, the title of the article, ill-known article published at RIA Novosti about what Russia should do to Ukraine, which was characterized, for instance, by Professor Snyder and as an that this article advocates for the elimination of Ukrainian people. So we don't want anything like that. But we would like really to understand and maybe to make you think more about what is going on with Russia. Because we know that there are these debates all over the place in the EU, for instance, maybe in the US as well, about whether it's just about Putin or not. I personally think that it's not only about Putin. And I believe that probably our guests also think so. And we would really like to understand their perspective in both historical, from the both historical point of view, historical perspective, but also, which is really, really interesting, from this sociological perspective and from the perspective of those fields of science that that Professor Varese is dealing with. And I personally think that organized crime and also Russian police state are the pillars on which the current Kremlin regime is exists. And both of these issues were researched by Professor Varese, meaning that, for instance, he wrote a book on Gulag, which is the Soviet labor camps. It's not in his biography that you might find on the Oxford website, but still. So sorry for this long introduction. First of all, I would like to address the question to Professor Grycak. Because recently he wrote an excellent piece, and I would really recommend to everyone to read it in Time. Basically, it was issued in Time. It's called "Russian Problem Goes Far Beyond Putin." So my question is pretty simple: is how far this problem goes actually, if it's not only about Putin?
The question may be simple, but the answer is not simple, it's much complicated. Let me just refer to a specific conjectural fact. There has been such a presumption that Putin came to power and manipulated the public opinion of Russian, and therefore Russians not to be to blame, it's Putin, which is partly true. But the whole truth is that, judged by the opinion polls, which were conducted in the 90s, long before Putin came to power, there was a clear tendency that Russians are willing to, most of the Russians tend to trade liberty for stability. They were for censorship, they were for the restoring to the great status power, to great military, to show all the world their, so to say, the supremacy, so to say. There has been an excellent article written by the Richard Pipes, the Harvard professor of Russian history, and he also basically this main point, it was published in, I believe, 2004. That basically point was that it was not Putin that made Russia. It was Putin, it was Russia who welcomed Putin, so to say. And Putin was just using this trend. This is a very kind of specific context which goes to the 90s. But as a historian, I say this is kind of the larger picture here. And here we refer to another rather famous Russian historian, Alexander Yanov, who was a former dissident, expelled from the Soviet Union, who spent 40 or 50 years of his life in the United States, made a career there. By the way, he just passed away a week ago before the war started. And he made a point that actually it's not the first time, it's not even the second time. It's like a regular pendulum, started at least from the 16th century, which means basically, he says that basically Russia is essentially a European country, essentially European country, judging by the culture, by the way the Russians behave, but there is some problem that every time they're rationally trying to liberalize the country, to put it on the Western track, what follows is a kind of a longer period of reaction and a more severe repression, so to say. And it's like a pendulum going both directions, and suddenly you have since the collapse of Russian Empire in 1917, you have a nine months of the liberal reforms, and then you have 40 years of Stalin and Lenin. Then you have a thaw of Khrushchev, and then you have 20 years of Brezhnev. Then you have 10 years or so of Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and then 22 years of Putin. So this is what he says, it's a problem, how to stop the Russian pendulum. Because the real drama or tragedy of Russian history, that every time the Russian elite is trying to emancipate the society doesn't accept this kind of project. This is a kind of very kind of amicable problem, so to say. They want to have a kind of strong hand. And this is the idea, and actually, Yanov until the very end discussed this. What should be done to stop this pendulum? So I'm saying it's much more deeply rooted problem, which is rooted in history.
Thank you. We're going to discuss and further how it's possible to stop it, if it's possible. But I also would like to ask you to mention, because you quote very interesting like quotations, or you cite very interesting quotation from Russian kind of classical literature personalities who often refer to as a great Russian culture. and these people are often cited by Western intellectuals as those people that are representing the great Russian culture, which may provide the alternative to the current Putin's kind of narratives. But from Ukrainian standpoint, and not only Ukrainian, maybe former colonies of Moscow, so to say, if I may say so, these names are controversial. I mean Dostoevsky, I mean Bulgakov, I mean Nabokov, and others. Can you please comment on that? So, and is it possible now to reconsider this cultural heritage, and how exactly? Can we consider, for instance, those post-colonial studies that were in the West and that provided or suggested the reconsideration of some of the Western cultural heritage, including literature and other fields? So is it possible, or Ukraine should invent something else?
First of all, thank you for this question. First of all, I'm not a specialist in literature studies, and I have some kind of idiosyncrasies, my personal to post-colonial studies, for a variety of reasons which we will discuss. Because I basically did with hard facts rather than interpretations. And hard facts are that basically have a whole bunch of famous Russian cultural figures who at one time or another say probably the most disputable things about other nations, particularly about Ukrainians, Poles, Jews, all the kind of things, all, including those who are Nobel Prize winners like Solzhenitsyn and more specifically Brodsky. Brodsky, before his death, wrote just a extremely, so say, hateful verse on the Ukrainian independence. And it's for hard to read even for Russian, because it's so intense the hatred to Ukrainians, specifically to Ukrainians, and basically believe that what Ukrainians did was a kind of great mistake, because sooner or later Ukrainians will get back to Russia, because Ukrainians are not non-nation, they are not viable, so to say, so they'll go back. You could trace it back to Dostoevsky and to Pushkin. There's a lot of quotations like that. There is whole articles, monographs written about this kind of xenophobic side of Dostoevsky. But that's not the problem, because you would hardly qualify Dostoevsky as a liberal. He was not. He was conservative, he's a monarchist, all the kind of thing. The real problem is that even when you deal with Russian liberals, you still have problems. Every liberalism has its limitations, and every liberalism has kind of stepstone, which was stuck. Say for the most European liberalism, one of the most this kind of problematic issue was Jewish issue. They couldn't find the solution to Jewish issue, and therefore quite often were anti-Semitic. When you're talking about the Russian liberalism, quite often it's anti-Ukrainian. The stumbling block for Russians, it's the Ukrainian question, without a doubt. There's such even saying that Russian liberals ends when the Ukrainian question starts. So this is basically what I'm saying here, that it narrows down the field for the future reconciliation, Ukrainian-Russian, to a very, very kind of limited, so to say, possibility or space. There are some brilliant intellectuals who are quite different. I could name them, like Alexander Gertsin, like Chernyshevsky, like Andrei Sakharov, who in that sense was really kind of, very open to Ukrainian question. But the problem is they're very few, and they're not heard. They're very much marginalized. Or like nowadays, Dmitry Bykov, or Yuri Latinina, or Nevzorov. And important thing that many of them are Jewish-Russian, or Russian by Jewish origin, because it also creates some kind of the liberal tradition. They might differ. But again, most of them, they either exiled or imprisoned. And their voices are practically nowadays are not heard.
Does it mean you don't see any future for them in the Russia of today?
Everyone has a future, so to say. The future, so I'm saying, it's not issue to deal with the culture or the issue with on the personal level. It must be done, some structural changes must be done. I mean, like a hardware, so to say, institutional changes, because I don't believe that Russian issue could be resolved, but that matter also can be resolved, just by addressing culture. Because I believe the problems lies very deeper. It's historical problem. Historical drama are mostly cured by the structural reforms. And I would say the major reform is political modernization, which means how to limit central power, which is the challenge for every country. But for Russia, it's a persistent country, persistent problem. They never managed really to limit the central power, so to say. And this is I would say in this sense, Ukraine is doing much better. I don't say this is quite success, but at least doing better, because you have a constant change of power. every 4 years, and you never know who will be next president in Ukraine. You have a really kind of political struggle in Ukraine, quite often not quite, as I say, sympathetic, without a doubt. You have still a corruption, but still there is some movement in Ukraine. Ukraine is still moving in this kind of direction. Moving, I'm not saying to the liberal democracy, but still have as a kind of aim. And if war won't stop that, probably we'll have this the direction further. And what I mean here, structural problem is that we don't have it in Russia. So what I'm saying here, I don't believe that. Again, this I'm saying. We had many questions like that in 19th century. We have a Polish question, we have a German question, we have a Jewish question, which were not resolved. They must resolve in 20th century, quite often with very bloody conflicts and results. Let's take it. But the thing is that my experience, my imagination, there are two major questions which still not resolved nowadays, which is Ukrainian question and the Russian question. I believe that Ukraine is much closer to solution this question because they are moving in the direction of political modernization. And for Russia, it's still a very big challenge and big problem because structural changes must be that. And my imagination, again, sorry to talk into too much, that no nation could resolve this question on its own. Some outside assistance should be, say, is needed, like German after the war. In Europe after the war, basically Europe was very much authoritarian in the 2030s. If you look at Italy or France, even in France, say there was a direction of autonomy. So I'm seeing here, there must be some kind of, there must be work in both directions. Must be go from the up, from below, some changes, opposition movement, but also some outside. And this, if they work together, then could resolve. So what I'm saying here, once Russia would be defeated, which I wish very strongly so, there must be imposed some kind of structural rules also from outside, some pressure on the Russia to make it, this reform really happen. Because otherwise, I don't believe that Russians now, the Russian side, are really able to perform this kind of changes.
Thank you so much. You have answered almost all of my questions that I was going to ask you, but thank you very much for that. And I would like to proceed with your ideas and maybe to go deeper into how we can work with that or how it's possible. But before that, I would like to turn to Professor Vareze. And again, what I found really interesting is that you've researched, as I said previously, both Russian state machinery in terms of its violence, but also organized crime, which is a very important element for the current Russian state. And Russia is often referred to even by Western experts as mafia state. So do you agree with that definition as an academic, probably? And also, do you think that, given your background as a researcher, that current Russian all-out war against Ukraine was foreseeable? So it was something that we could expect. Because we, as Ukrainians, we expected that, unfortunately. We tried to prevent it, but it was almost impossible. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. And I'm really here to learn. And so it's a real pleasure to be here and to meet you and to understand better the situation myself. Now, let me try to answer. Let's start from the second question. Was it foreseeable? Well, I think it was pretty obvious that it was foreseeable because there was such an amount of military hardware building up on the border. There were very irrational requests on the part of the Russian authorities, which were not going to be accepted. So I think it was foreseeable, and it's a pity that many in the West did not foresee that and thought it was not going to happen. So I think it was foreseeable, and it's part of a general trend in Russian society, in Russian politics, of increasing aggression and increasing authoritarianism, and I would say an increasing conception of nationalism, which is very imperialistic, and it's not based on the concept of civic nationalism, which allows every kind of person, whether you are Jewish, Polish, Hungarian, Ukrainian, to live together under the rule of law, which I think is what Ukraine is achieving. It's a sort of conception of nationalism in which you either become like us or you are not worth to exist. And so this is the sort of nationalism that was building up in Russian cultural elites for a long time. And I think we didn't see that really, or at least most people did not pay attention to that. Some books have mentioned it, But it's now incredibly significant that these views has taken hold of the Russian elite and they acted upon it. So while to us they seem like crazy ideas, they're actually very much part of the Russian elite, which they acted upon it. So that to me was foreseeable, and it's a pity that many had not foreseen it. The other point that is already been made, but I think is very important, is that this imperial view is not just one person, and it's part of the general, is also sadly of the liberal elite. Because we have to go back and read what the liberal elite had said about the Ukraine, thinking that it was just an appendix to Russia, not understanding the political transformation of the Ukraine since the end of the Soviet Union. And so that, I think, is there is a lot of work to be done to tell this political elite that something they missed and was not happening. I think also that's why they miscalculated so much when they came to invade and attack this country. So that to me is was foreseeable, and it was not foreseen as it should have been by intellectuals in the West. Now the first question you asked me is about organized crime in Russia. So you had a lot of organized crime in the transition to the market economy in the 1990s. There was a lot of there was mess in the society, and people of all kinds were taking advantage of that, including organized criminals that were somewhat independent of the state in the 90s. But again, what we have seen is an increasing authoritarianism that also affects traditional independent organized crime that become then part of the state machinery. So that's how I think about it. So paradoxically, the kind of organized crime you have in Italy, like the Sicilian mafia, is always been outside the state and in competition, and sometimes they made deals, but ultimately they were outside the state. In very authoritarian societies, such as Nazi Germany or Stalinism, or now increasingly in Russia, this organized crime becomes almost part of the state as opposed to be outside of it. So that's how I think about organized crime and in the current situation.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to go back to your definition, maybe, that you've just mentioned about imperialistic nationalism in Russia. So what I find interesting is that for the previous maybe decade, when it comes to nationalism in our region, it's oftentimes that Ukraine was mentioned in this context, like Ukraine has this nationalistic problem, which I think is to the much more lesser extent than Russia. But Russia was not discussed, the processes inside Russian society in terms of nationalism and chauvinism, which was there indeed. So do you think, I'm not sure whether it's good, it would be good for you or correct, politically correct or whatever, to comment on the, so to say, actions or activities of your colleagues, but nevertheless, just trying to assess the Western academic and expert thinking. Do you find that it was pretty naive when it comes to Russia and the threat that it poses in terms of this trends on imperialism, nationalism, etc.? Because I found that it was really naive, it was too romantic, and the things that were not romantic at all for Ukrainians, for Crimean Tatars, for Chechens, for Belarus people, because it was a real oppression, was romantic for some maybe intellectuals also in the West. And this goes far, very far in history, maybe at least in the Soviet times, So what do you think on that? So was it naive thinking from the standpoint of Western intellectuals?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think there is a problem among many Western intellectuals, and it's the point that they don't recognize the importance of freedom, liberty. Liberty and freedom are crucial elements of society, and they tend to forget that and somehow think that Russia was a strong state, was producing order, social order, there was no crime, hence it was okay. But you cannot have social policies without freedom. And so they have underestimated the evil of the absence of freedom. And I think also they haven't paid enough attention to the Ukraine or to smaller countries, because these countries like Ukraine has had a free elections. They had a change of parliament, the change of prime minister, which didn't happen in Russia. So it is a country which is it's a free democratic country with change of elections. During the post-war period in Italy, we never really changed the ruling party. It was always the Christian Democrats in power. So if you judge by that definition, there was more of a change in political elite within Ukraine. So I think there was a kind of Western intellectuals thought that you should always look at Moscow as opposed to other countries, other parts of Eastern Europe, and a sort of a Moscow-centric, thinking that everything happens from Moscow. Missing out on what I think is a wonderful experience of democracy in the post-Soviet space, which happens not just in Ukraine, but also in other parts of the post-Soviet space. And I think is a great inspiration for all those who love freedom and think that freedom cannot go without, or social work, social policy cannot exist without freedom. So for me, that is what Western elite have missed. And it's really a shame. You can also see in journalism, in some political parties that love the strong man, but then they don't want to live under the strong man. They rather live in a democratic society. And so I think it's very hypocritical not to recognize that we can say things in the West because we have democratic institutions. The moment they go, you cannot be free, and that is a huge loss for everybody. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, just a small clarification, but do you find that current dramatic situation with the all-out aggression of Russia against Ukraine is a chance maybe to review this regional landscape?
I totally agree. I totally think so. I think the aggression has now shown everybody, even those who were ignorant or not paying attention, what is the nature of that particular nationalism that is oppressive. So I think that it's a great moment, in fact, to revise and revisit this view. And I think a lot of very good intellectuals, for instance, in my country of origin, in Italy, have come out very clearly in defense of Ukrainian democracy and in solidarity, of course, with the struggle against invasion. So I think, in that sense, is a positive element. We had a discussion yesterday, and you were saying that unfortunately we still don't know how much the price will be that this country basically will have to pay for that recognition, and that's really dramatic and tragic. But I think there is a hope, and I think now nobody can ever ignore what happened. You know, what happens every day in Ukrainian land.
Mr. Varese, you studied a lot in mafia. Yeah,
Yes.
I would like to get back to that question because we announced that you're great in that. You wrote books on the Russian mafia, Mafias on the Move, and Mafia Life, where you described Japanese mafia, Sicilian mafia, Russian mafia. How should we connect it with what's happening today? What made Russia a criminal state? Is it a criminal state or a violent state? What made it? And what should we learn from it, from your conclusions, to make, or the world should know, to make right moves now? Like, for example, if we were talking with, I remember conversations even before, a few weeks before the invasion, and some people from different countries of the Western world were asking me like, oh, but like, what do you think? What will he do? Or what will Russia do, and what will be their reaction? And I was reminding myself, there's a specific word in Ukrainian, I don't know how to explain it into English, ohopnik. It's, you know, like
Thug.
Maybe thug, yeah,
Yes,
partly.
so.
And from what we learn now, Russia behaves like that kind of person, like we had in the 90s here, and that they are afraid of power. Is it so? Is it what you learned, or what are the conclusions for our right moves now?
Well, I hope I can answer. It's a very difficult question. If you think about what is a mafia, ultimately, a mafia is a form of governance. So they govern territory. A mafia group governs a territory, and it governs a territory without allowing those who are governed to vote. and to express their views. So you cannot vote and elect your mafia boss if you are a citizen of the mafia state, of the mafia territory. So in, say, parts of southern Italy, there are mafia groups that control a neighborhood, and you have to pay a tax to that mafia group if you want to operate. So if you have a shop, if you have a construction company, if you have a business, you pay a tax to this authority, which is not democratic, it's not legitimate, and yet it controls the territory. So the essence of that entity is the absence of rights. So you don't have any right under a mafia state. So it's not that you can invoke the criminal code or some rules that you can take the mafia to court, right? It's absence of rights, absence of basic liberties, and also absence of democracy. Does it make sense? So you see what I'm trying to say? I'm trying to say that if you think about a mafia territory, or a territory governed by the mafia, you are a victim ultimately of that power. So that, I think, what can be learned about these countries, say, I don't know, North Korea, you know, it's, to me, that is a mafia state, because you have a entity able to control a territory, but there is no right for the people in that territory, and there is no choice to choose who you are being governed by. So that, to me, is a sort of analytical, deep connection between what I study and what we are talking about. But I should say that I'm not a political scientist, so I'm now speaking a bit outside of my own territory, but I see the difference between democracy and the mafia. Democracy is a political organization in which you have rights, so you have a criminal code, a civil code, you can take the state to court. If the state overcharges you, you think you're paying too much taxes, you take the state to court and you redress the court, and the state can lose in court against you as a claimant. So that's an amazing construction of the liberal state, because the state can be losing in court against you. And then you can vote for those who control you. And that's democracy. Now, if you don't have that, I think you are very close to the mafia world.
Exactly, and as at least 8 years, I have 8 years of experience of being human rights activist, and we've been following a lot those politically motivated cases in Russia and in occupied Crimea, and I should say that it's impossible that the state loses in Russian court. So that's one of the issues that you've raised. And now, before maybe giving the floor to colleague journalists who may want to ask some questions, I would like to ask one more question. And to some extent, Professor Gryzak has already answered this question, but now we can see that there are some various suggestions on what should be done with Russia, so to say. And you can see that, for instance, there should be a denuclearization, deputinization, denazification, whatever, the federalization that you've referred to, I think so, although you didn't mention this particular word. So what's your formula for the successful Russian transformation? And most important, how it is possible to achieve. So as far as I understand, your idea is that Russia should be defeated in the military terms, and there should be cooperation between this Russian society, who should be like in a position and ready to change, and some external forces. So can you explain how do you see this process?
As a historian, I just to say that what just Professor Varese explained, it's a norm. Mafia-type state is a norm in global history. Violence is a norm, mafia state is norm, democracy is exception. This is very important. And basically, again, the mafia-type state, they also mean synonymical poverty. South of Italy, North Korea, because basically, what is the system? This is kind global system. This is throughout most of the world history. What you have power elites which collect the rents from below, and they share it among them, so to say. And the share of the rent that you get depends on your hierarchy. And everything depended on the personal connections. What happens is a personal connection. Therefore, mafia is a godfather It's godfather, must be really father, so to say. And which means basically absence of any institutional trust, any solidarity, society is atomized. Give it Gulag, North Korea, you have this kind of examples. And this is a norm. This norm ceased to be a norm on a certain area of the world, which is basically the Western Europe, and basically throughout the last 2 centuries. I'm not saying because it's an exception that it could be done. It could be done because it functions. It functions much better than any other system, so to say. And what I'm saying here that this norm now is extending and looks like a global, becoming really kind of global. Because I look at this direction, I look at this sense as a kind of Arabic revolution, Occupy, revolution in other countries like in Armenia, recently Belarus. So what I'm saying, this is a global trend. So basically, taken historically, it takes decades, if not centuries, because you have to work very deeply in history. Not probably, I know what is could be adequate word, culture, social relations, but you at least have to start somewhere, because it's important to start somewhere and to get direction. And the main direction is you have to limit central power. This is the main prediction. You have to divide this power. You have to divide in 3 to 3 parts. This must be independent courts. This must be independent decision of the kind of sign. Right? This is what I'm saying here. Because you couldn't get a rule of law immediately, especially in the country that has a problem, historical problem, so to say. So therefore, I may be optimistic about Russia in long run, but not optimistic in the short run. Because basically, but at least you have to start somewhere. Because if you don't start it somewhere, you will have this kind of repeating pattern everywhere. We couldn't have this kind of enemy for years and years. It costs us too much, so to say. So basically, what I'm concerning, our attention has to be, first of all, formal on the political reforms, on reforms of this disarming mafia state. And this is nothing here, original. I don't believe Russia is an exceptional country. You could claim that there is no big difference between the mafia state of Putin and the empire of Incas or empire of Egypt. It's the same type. You just have to disarm it. And there's a lot of studies has been done. There's a lot of experience how to do these sort of things. But the first thing important must be sufficient number of the people who are really willing that. Who has this kind of feeling of that this is something which is not normal, could not be tolerated. So basically what I'm saying here, again, I'm going too fast, I'm going too long. Basically, it boils down to issue of values. Liberty as a value, dignity as a value. Because if you have this kind of value, you couldn't afford to, you couldn't agree to have somebody who will decide what you have to vote and all kinds of things. So basically what I'm saying, this is what Ukraine nowadays experience, but it takes, again, it takes hundreds of years, sentencing, not even decades, but a long record to make Ukraine that happen, move this direction. So again, I'm going too fast. I'm going too far. I believe that Ukraine deserves a Marshall Plan, kind of Marshall Plan, because with this kind of Marshall Plan, we would have hardly would have a nowadays Europe. So I would say that we have to do something in terms like that, not probably Marshall Plan, but something with Russia, which means to impose political reforms in exchange for sanctions, for lifting the sanctions, to say, lifting the sanctions. This must be done. This must be kind of talk, so to say. So there must be a price. There must be a price, and the people, if not they're willing to play, they have to be forced to play. Because basically, I believe that the conditions, life conditions, would be so poor and the situation will be misery, so to say. So I believe there'll be no big choice, but basically says. So I'm saying here, yes, we have to lift sanctions sooner or better, but only in exchange to some political reforms.
So just a clarification, you claim that it will take like a very long time, which obviously
generations. It always takes generations.
But
generations.
For instance, now we can see often people referring to the German experience after World War II and denazification, which was undertaken throughout like several decades. It was
20 years, more or less. 20 years.
So is it possible? Is it a role model for Russian society, or it's not?
Without a doubt, I still believe, and it's probably not so popular. I believe there is, so to say, European gene in the Russian culture. There is. I'm not saying it's defining, but still is this. Just you have to work with this. This was Jan Wywoł used to say, the Jan I was preferring. So you just could not discount Russia as a kind of hopeless country. Because there's nothing really exceptional. Most of the countries went the same way. Because just what the problem is, Russia is latecomer, or not the latecomer, is the last one to follow this route. Because basically, look, if you look at the 18th century Poland or 19th century, it was hopeless at that time. Even in interwar Poland was hopeless at that time. Or Hungary state. All these kind of problems, so to say. So I'm saying this is why it's good to be historian, because historian always give you some kind of the narrow space for optimism. Because if other nations did, why Russia should not do it? I don't believe that any nation is such exceptional, so to say. What I'm saying, we have to have the extension to not to go with the tactical solutions, but with strategical solutions. Mm-hmm. Because history, if this is problem rooted in history, you have to talk strategically, not tactically. Because tactical doesn't work. You have in 20, 30 years, you have another Putin.
And your colleague from the Catholic University, Vice Rector Miroslav Marinovich, who spent many years in Soviet camps imprisoned, was in our studio a few days ago, and he called it humanization of Russia. That we have to have a humanization.
Call it as you wish. Call it as you wish. Europeization, humanization, like that. I'm saying this is still strategical problem, and I believe this is exactly what is not quite often, so to say, ignored by the West.
Whose problem is that? You know, because I think it's important.
It's a global problem. Russia is a global problem. Russia is a problem for everyone, including for Russians, but unfortunately for Ukrainians, very much, but also for Westerners, because for everybody, they keep tolerated this kind. They keep tolerated this kind of state for a variety of reasons, which I wouldn't discuss. But since it's a global problem, it has to be resolved globally. Yeah. I believe this is probably like a warming or the climate changes. Mm. This is the global problem, so to say. Mm-hmm. So I believe this probably even increase the chances. Because the thing is, again, I'm talking it, no nation could resolve this problem on its own. So I believe this is global problem. It makes us, but then we have the global efforts, but the global but strategical, it's very important. Not just superficial, tactical, but strategical solution to the Russian problem.
Professor Varese, do you have answer also?
Yes. What's your answer to the question about the successful formula of transformation of Russia? We also don't think that it's hopeless, but just we try to understand what are the solutions, possible solutions.
So let me add that I completely agree with what you just said, that I think what is happening here is a fight for democracy, and it's a fight that is not just about Ukrainians, it's a fight for everybody in the civilized world. So that's why I'm here, that's why I think we should be solidarity and help as much as we can. So that it's really crucial to understand that. So it's absolutely not just a problem for Ukraine. Now, what to do? Well, certainly from our standpoint, we should certainly help and support those Russians who do protest and who are arrested and put in jail, who protest against Putin. But if you look at it sociologically, I should say, military defeat is actually often leading to a transformation in a country. Again, as you said yesterday to me, history is open, so we don't know how history will go. But certainly military defeat, which will protect Ukrainians, but also lead to a defeat of the invasion, I think it's certainly important. And so for me, that is a first important step. But then I totally agree. I think each of us has to think, what can I do in my personal small world? Because obviously I have no power. So I think from my point of view is to be as close to Ukrainian institutions, Ukrainian institutions of higher learning, and help and show solidarity, and also speak to the Russian intellectual elite and make them aware of what we were just saying earlier. So this is what I can do as an intellectual and as a professor. But I think military defeat from a global sense is certainly important, and it's important on many, many levels, of course, not just for Russia. It's important for the survival of people in this wonderful country.
Thank you.
And I'll just quote one short comment in our broadcast. What to do with Russia? Kill all their soldiers who come here with weapon. Gas and petrol embargo. Exclude Orban and his country from European Union, and more weapon to Ukraine for chasing finally the Russian invasion.
We may wish whatever it is, but let's be realistic. Even so, you couldn't kill all the Russians. You couldn't exclude Orban. which means that we still have to deal with this. So I'm saying again, let's forget, okay, we could go with slogans, but I'm telling again, we need strategical solutions. Neither of this, what you just quoted, is a strategical solution. You may do it, exclude Orban, kill the Russian soldiers, but you will have the repetitive pattern in 20, 30 years, you will have a Putin again.
Exactly. So now let's turn to
Questions.
our audience, if
Yeah.
we have some.
Questions or comments? Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah. Please, can you take?
Oh, sure. Professor Gryzak, I hope I didn't mispronounce that. You mentioned the phrase the Ukrainian question, which brings to mind the Eastern question and the Jewish question and other questions that afflicted Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. What are the origins of that question in Russian thought? When did Russian leaders and the Russian intellectual elite start worrying about the formation of a Ukrainian identity? I know about when they began worrying about Ukrainian nationalism, but when did they start thinking about Ukraine as a separate thing and the identity as a separate thing and as a threat to Russia?
It's kind of complicated question. Thank you for this question, but the answer is complicated. But say very generally, it's mostly the second half of 19th century. Before the 19th century, mid-19th century, not that many people, Russians, Ukrainians, think about themselves as being enemies to each other. Let's put it this way, until the middle of 19th century, mostly Ukrainians would saw mostly probably Tatars, I'm sorry to say, or Turks or Russians, as not Russians, Poles as enemies. The shift occurred in the second half of 19th century, and because of the oppressive character, oppressive efforts of Russian Empire, first of all, ban of the language, ban the Ukrainian language twice. So this is what really happened. Because at that time, Russian Empire at least started to realize the dangers, the threat of Ukrainian question, so to say. This is exactly what Ukrainian question says. And then the peak, I would say, would be the First World War and the 1917 revolution. This will probably be the start when Ukraine really started to have a Russian problem in the sense of military aggression. Before it's like a verbal aggression or kind of state efforts, so to say, but in the mid-19th century. But then, 1914, 1917, it was really when the problem started. So at least 100 years of this Russian-Ukraine undeclared war.
If I might ask a follow-up question, so did they see it as constituting merely a geographical threat to their empire, or was there something more to it?
Geographical threat, without a doubt. Also, the very important issue that Ukraine is the largest non-Russian territory in Russian Empire, and therefore rich in resources, extremely rich in resources, human resources. So therefore, it's kind of quite typical colonial imperial relations. But what was not typical. And that is some kind of additional problem, which increased this problem immensely, skyrocketed, so to say, that Ukraine and Ukrainian territory has extremely deeply symbolic meaning for Russia. Because they consider that Ukraine is a kind of cradle of their civilization, of the Orthodox, which it basically is, in a large extent. But they believe it's only their cradle. They impose some kind of copyright on this issue. So therefore, they could not imagine. They could not just fathom the idea that Russia, Ukraine could exist. Russia could without Ukraine, and Ukraine could without Russia, because this is their territory, so to say. So on symbolical level, I couldn't even probably say, give some kind of Britain, Scotland, probably yes and no. Britain, Wales. I don't know, it's hard to say. The problem is, see, there's the problem here, that Russia is very untypical empire, very untypical. Because in sense, in most of the cases, you have a clear distinction what is the core, whereas the metropole and whereas colony. And they're mostly divided by seas and by the oceans. Nobody claimed that India is a core, or Algeria is the core. But Russian claims Ukraine is a core, or Baltic is a core, which is the same, which is the one of the basic. It's a geography, but this is mental geography, so to say.
In that sense, it's reminiscent of Israel and Palestine.
Yes, to large extent, but then again, still Israel and Palestine, they're very much different in their culture and their religion, so to say, and here you have something which makes this country more, because they're both Orthodox. They claim the same legacy, so to say.
So we have to kind of take their talk of an existential threat sort of seriously. Some Russians do think in that sense that Ukraine is the heart of us. Sometimes.
Without a doubt. It's a, I'm sorry to say that. It's an existential war. And therefore, I hardly believe this could be some armistice is possible. You could have an armistice, but for a while. It's like, I'm sorry to say, it's like a war between Rome and Carthage, because somebody has to be deleted. And the problem is the question, who is the Carthage? It's Russia, Moscow, or Kyiv. We hope very much will be Moscow, so to say. But this is very much war that goes for decades and decades, and we don't see the end of the war. This is war for existential. In a sense, it's much more reminiscence to the Second World War. War of destruction, than rather for the First World War.
Sorry, I was just thinking it is also it's like a crazy way of thinking, because each European state has got within it minorities, or bits of it which are not inside the state, so Croatia or parts of Yugoslavia theoretically are Italians. So if you start to open that can of worm, you never end. So you just have to accept that there is a independent Ukrainian state. Within it, there are people who may be Hungarians, Jewish, speaking Russian. And if you don't accept that principle, you go back to this aggressive nationalism that says, oh, everybody who is vaguely connected to my culture thousands of years ago should be within my territory. But if you do that and you apply that to the world, it's total war everywhere. So that's why the post-World War, Second World War system was based on the fact that you respect the borders. And if you start to not to accept that principle, it's the end of everything. So that's why I think we should also consider that as part of the struggle here. That has to be made clear. You cannot just take bits of pieces of land that you think because thousands of years, there was a church that you vaguely could. That would be crazy. Sorry to interject.
I apologize for returning to such a general question, but it's one that's still going on in the United States. And I had conversations just last night about how to treat the Russian people. And so at the beginning of the war, many Western media outlets phrased this war as Putin's war, not Russia's war. I think that's changing a bit, but not quickly enough. And in that same vein, do we treat the Russians, are they victims or are they participants? Victims of the Russian state TV, and how do we treat them going forward?
No, you go. I'm very
I found out recently a very amazing statement by a lady that says basically Russia is the first victim of Putin, which reminds me very much by this famous saying by Austrians that Austria is the first victim of Hitler. The problem is that Austria was very willingly succumbing to the Hitler power in 1938, so to say. If not the Austrian decisions, most Austrians to join Germany, there will be hardly Hitler in this sense. They joke that probably one of the most successful, the biggest success of Austria is to persuade everybody that Mozart was Austrian and Hitler was German, so to say. So in this sense, I believe it totally makes sense. I was starting there, that basically Putin is very much Russian. Without that, this is personal will of Putin. This is Putin who started the war. If not somebody else there was in power in Russia nowadays, they'll be probably very not kind to Ukrainian. There'll be some kind of the struggle, whatever, but not military aggression. In a sense, very much personal Putin war. But what happened then, not just Russian permitted to Putin to start this war. They were very much willing somebody like Putin would come to power. I was quoting this kind of opinion polls in the 1990s. They was dreaming for somebody who will come and to restore, make Russian great again, the familiar topic, to raise it from the knees, so to say, the glorification of Stalin, all the kind of things. If you look, this is very much popular. It's a nonsense, but it's a nonsense that works. So what I'm saying is they're not just cheated. They wanted to be cheated. This is the biggest problem, so to say.
So will you say they are participants?
They are. They're not the participants. They are responsible. Very much. See, this is kind of weird thing. Most of Russians, whom I know, who are honest Russians, they keep asking me for forgiveness. If I'm not, blame me myself. But majority of them, they never even thought about asking for forgiveness because they said they're right. This is what I'm saying here. This is a kind of weird No, the kind of the situation. What I'm saying here, the Russians are responsible. I'm not saying they must be brought to the judge, to the court, but there's at least something which is called moral responsibility for the war, like the Germans under Hitler, because they made it happen. There's not made it happen; they were willing to make it happen.
Professor Varese, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think the responsibility also of the system, I mean, the fact that there are no free press, the TV, as you mentioned, I think that leads to that sort of world view. So that's why it's very important to have free press and freedom, ultimately. So people are not making decisions with full information. I think there are people who are opposing the war and they are risking their life. In Russia, we've been arrested. I think 15,000 is the last time I read. And of course, the penalties are very high if you protest. I interviewed a Russian professor who, within a minute, who put up the sign against the war, was beaten in his head and brought to a police station. So I think we have to hook up to these people and try to make them important and show that they are the future of the country and not those who support the war.
I'm sorry to tell that. This is coming to my mind recently. There has been an article written by Litwell. You have do you pronounce the name? The author of the famous book, the novel about the Holocaust in this region. Litwell, I believe. No. I'm talking about literature. The author. He basically, let's put it this way. It doesn't really matter. It matters, but not in this context. He's describing in very details what was his reactions of his Moscow friends to events long before the war started. Like he was discussing the Chechen wars because he was there. He was describing all the kind of murders, of the kind of violence, all the kind of stuff. They said, "Give us a break. We don't want to listen about that." So because we were just tired with those kind of things. What I'm telling here, the level of the tolerance of Russian society, even the education, was very low, so to say. So basically, they keep the thing that may happen. So I'm not saying that they're killing. I'm sure that majority of Russian soldiers, or probably majority, some soldiers don't want to go to Ukraine because they just send this as a cannon fodder, and they understand that. But basically, this is their parents who are responsible that these kids would be sent because they never protested for that. They never protested during the First World War, they never protested during the Second World War, during the Georgian aggression, all that kind of thing. This is the example because it's like a snowball. Once you start it, you never stop.
I offer a counterpoint. Oh, sorry. A counter-argument is Afghanistan. One of the reasons the Afghanistan war went so badly for Russia is that mothers and families began protesting, and they said, we are not going to allow our sons to go any longer. When the famous zinc coffins started coming back, I forget her name, the Nobel Prize winner who wrote the Boys in Zinc. One of the reasons the war collapsed and the Soviet Union collapsed was that families began protesting the war in Afghanistan.
You know, I'm old enough to remember that. It's exaggeration. The war could go forever. Yeah. Because it was still Soviet Union. Nobody really wanted to protest. I don't remember any kind of large manifestations against the Afghanistan war. The thing that the Soviet Union has started to collapse, this was the collapse was evident. And because of the collapse, they started to draw back the Russian war, so to say. I'm not saying there was no protest. There was some concern, but nothing, something which just shocked me recently. There is one of the leader Russian opposition, Ryzhkov. You may know him name. And he gave his interview about the large protest in Moscow. You may remember 10 years ago. It was a large protest on both, which was sympathized very much. And he basically says that there was a crucial point. If there will be 500,000 of Muscovites coming to the streets, it will end the regime.
For the corruption of the election in 2011.
2011. It was only 250, twice as less. You see me here. It's 8 million, what Moscow, 8 million or more? Like 11 million. 11 million, 500,000. In Ukraine, on the first weekend after the Soviet students were beaten, there was 1 million on the street. In Kyiv, which is much smaller, country which is smaller. This is what I'm saying here, this responsibility. This could be stopped long before, 10 years ago. Like 200 is small, what is 200,000? Probably much more intellectuals, whoever, office workers, IT people, so to say, to come to the city. This will be stopped. So this is the problem, I believe.
We should finish probably.
I would have probably the last question, if we don't have any other from journalists here. You mentioned a lot about criminal state, about Russia as a criminal state and a violent state. You mentioned about responsibility. If we combine these things together today, what do you think about the future of responsibility of all these criminal atrocities that are happening through the last 45 days?
These atrocities are horrific, and they should be documented carefully so that people should be brought to justice. And of course, this city is where concepts such as genocide and crime against humanity were thought. And so that's also why I'm very happy to be here, in a sense, because it's a way to remind all of us that there is natural law, there is international law that has to be upheld by the civilized nations. So for me, those who commit these crimes have to be held responsible. And that's the essence of the liberal and democratic state. And you have also individual responsibility, not just state responsibility. You can refuse to carry out some orders. The famous book by Hannah Arendt on the banality of evil is crucial here, because you cannot just say, oh, I was ordered. I think it's something that you would maybe agree with. You have to take personal responsibility as well as attack the general responsibility of the state. So for me, the concept of freedom, democracy, rule of law, responsibility, criminal justice, crime against humanity, genocide are crucial concepts in the armor of the civilized state and the democratic state. So to me, obviously, we intellectuals can only do so much. And I think especially sociologists, and one of the things we can do is to help document these events and have websites, have testimonies, tape recorded testimonies, so that in the future we will not forget, and that's very important, and bring these people to justice. And what is happening here is also on such a level of tragedy that unfortunately compares with one of the greatest tragedies in European histories. And so that's why we cannot ignore or forget.
You believe we will bring them to justice?
Well, I think I believe, yes, I believe. Now, will it happen? I don't know. But I think we have to believe, and we have to try. And you'll be surprised. And we cannot really give up on that. I think it's the essence of the democratic mind to believe in justice, and also to want to follow procedures and proper procedures, because that is how you bring people to justice. And so that, to me, yeah, I would believe it. Now, of course, we don't always get what we wish.
Yes, but let me just say that for us, it's also not a matter of belief as a state, I mean, and as a society, but a matter of how we act. And Ukraine was trying really hard throughout all these years to document all the international crimes that are taking place in Donbass, Russian-controlled Donbass, and in the occupied Crimea. And now there's this joint efforts of the state and civil society to document properly all the crimes committed. So I'm just saying that it's also our responsibility, and we now have to try hard in order to gain this justice. But I think that that's the next question after the one is how to end this aggressive war and how to make Russia calm down. Sorry for that wording. Professor Gryzak, would you like to comment on this justice?
The chances or possibilities to bringing the war criminals to the court depends on the end of the war. Depends on how the war will end, so to say. It is probably some kind of armistice that probably it won't be possible, so to say, because this will be part of the armistice, not to follow this kind of atrocities. I'm sorry to say that, but this is let's be realistic. But this will end with the collapse of Russia. Yes, that very much so. That very much so. I believe this will be. But still, anyway, any kind of scenario we have to put it on. We put this on the table as a kind of agenda. We have to prepare all the kind of documents. We have to push the governments, all the governments, including our governments, in this kind of direction. Something which is very important, which is not mentioned, that we have atrocities on both sides, without a doubt. And this inevitable. Every war has it, so to say. So I believe it's very important for Ukrainian state also to imply justice on all possible atrocities without exception. Because idea is you have to, it must be real justice, to say. This is something probably not that much, no, but basically, this is not that much popular. There has been recently an article written by the editor of the Українського Правда. She pointed this point of view. So we have to mind this thing because otherwise we couldn't apply this kind of idea of crimes. The German example says us that basically only few criminals were really persecuted, and most of the elites who were responsible in sense, or at least was working under Hitler, they were still left intact. Because still you have the state to function. It's a cynical, but it is. Adenauer was not persecuted that many Nazis, so to say. Therefore, he was often quite blamed that he's kind of hypocrisy. But basically, if it comes as a generation, because there must be something to replace them. So basically, in Germany, it started only in the 60s, when they really started to talk. Even after Nuremberg, you have some kind of the consensus of society, or any society, to talk about the thing, to ask the uncomfortable questions to their father, to grandfathers, to say. This again, I'm saying it's a lot of work to do. It's a very much, but still we brought this kind of problem because really it's a Russian problem. It's a large problem, great problem. But basically what I'm saying again, it's very much depends on the end of the war. I would wish that war would end with the total collapse of Russia, but I wish also understand that I'm not willing, nobody wills to pay the highest price because the price will be extremely high. I would go for armistice without a doubt. It's like Zelensky says, because for us Ukrainians, human life, human dignity is the primary importance, so to say. But again, sooner or later, we have to proceed this kind of the strategical aims to punish all the atrocities for all atrocities of the war. Again, I'm saying too much because I'm just listening to a lot on genocide studies. We tend to forget that originally the concept of the genocide, as was suggested by Lemkin, was much more broader, because basically the whole character was preventive, how to prevent genocides. And the real problem is that when this concept was accepted or discussed by Organization of the United Nations, it was cut out, curtailed, not to offend several countries. United States, Soviet Union, France, all the kind of things. So what happened now, I believe it's also a very important problem. We have to return now to concept of genocide again, to reformulate it. Because if under this concept which is now, it's very hard to prove that this what happened in Bucha is really kind of genocide. Because the concept itself is very much curtailed, some say. So again, I'm saying it's a kind of very much global problem because you have to redefine the concept of genocide not to make it happen again. Like it happened in Rwanda or Yugoslavia, because keep repeating, because again, as very much as a mafia and violence, genocides are repetitive. They quite often, more often than we think.
And it's important that we're discussing these issues in Lviv, where Mr. Lemkin used to be and used to work. And that's why, to some extent, Professor Varese is here also to see the university, the local university. And so thank you so much. I think it was really, really interesting and important discussion with our outstanding guests. And thank you to colleagues who hosted it, and thanks to the audience that watched it. And I hope that we can proceed with the discussions and we can engage more intellectuals, both from Ukraine and international ones, to discuss this really crucial issue and to maybe suggest some strategic solutions, as Professor Gryzak said.
And I'm thankful also to all the speakers today and guests. And I think my personal conclusion from this conversation is that we found one of the solutions, important solution to the question, what should we do with Russia? Responsibility. So that we all have to be responsible, everyone at his own or her own place, like historians, lawmakers, governors, officials, journalists, diplomats, and I think that the more we do together, the better and the quicker the success and victory will be. And thanks all of you, and we are ready to continue these conversations further on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.